to every person in the Department of National Defense who has been affected by sexual harassment and violence and felt that we were not there to support you. I'm truly sorry.
An apology from the Minister of National Defense today that came with this announcement.
Madame Louise Arbour, former Supreme Court Justice, has agreed to lead an independent external comprehensive review of our institutional policies and culture.
The second review into military sexual misconduct in 6 years. This as the government continues to face questions about the allegations against then Defense Chief General Jonathan Vance about who knew what and when.
My office knew there was a complaint against General Vance. Nobody knew that it was a Me Too complaint.
He either isn't being straight with Canadians, Mr. Speaker, or his chief of staff chose to cover it up and keep him in the dark.
So what are the political consequences for this government? Is another review the solution to any of this? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj all join me. I'll start with you, Althea. What did you make of the announcement today? It certainly seemed familiar, I think would be a generous way to describe it.
You mean because it sounds exactly like what Marie Deschamps offered back in March of 2015, which the government inherited and would have been fully brief when they came into power? Yeah, it did sound like that. I would say the Liberal government has been very successful at espousing several values, especially progressive values. And this is a case, another case, some would argue, where it has not lived up to those values that they like to preach about. They could have acted on Madame Deschamps' report. He could have clearly just come out, he being the minister, come out and said that they, were sorry that they had not acted on this report sooner, and they were going to implement an independent body that would receive complaints that would be outside of the chain of command, and that they would look to build on how they could ensure that that process works better for the victims. I think that the part about the review on the military justice system is a very worthy one, a welcomed one by victims, because we know that military justice is not quite the same as the justice system that you would find down here on the Elgin Street Courthouse, where many accusers, even in serious cases of sexual assault, are able to plead to lesser military administrative fines, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and they escape criminal code convictions. The other thing I think this is really all about, frankly, is this is about trying to take this issue away from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office and about making it about a systemic problem. So a systemic problem that needs a systemic solution. And that's really what we saw today. And the timelines that are many months, maybe a year out, means outside of the election. Hopefully for the Liberals, they are trying to bury this, not an issue they want to talk about during the campaign.
It can be true, though, Andrew, that it is a systemic issue and that there are questions the Prime Minister's office needs to answer, too, involving all of these things, I would think, too.
Yeah, I mean, an independent investigative body outside the chain of command would have been handy in dealing with, let's say, the complaints against General Vance. But that committee, that body wasn't put in place, though it was recommended 6 years ago. The report has been sitting on the minister's desk. And it would appear that part of the reason it wasn't enacted was because of General Vance. The minister knew going in, or should have known, that there was at least red flags raised about General Vance's conduct going back some years. He certainly was told 3 years ago that there were complaints against him and did nothing about it. But even more concerning than what happened 3 years ago has been what's been going on more recently. This issue is no longer about who knew what when, so much as who did what and said what and for what reason in the Prime Minister's office and around them. We know, for example, that not only did Minister Sejan not do anything about it, the complaint himself, but he didn't even pass it on to the Privy Council office, as he claimed. In fact, what his office did was punt it over to the Prime Minister's office, who then called in the PCO, who did nothing. So the involvement of the Prime Minister's office, I mean, should not be a surprise. This government, even more than past governments, all roads run through the Prime Minister's office. And that's why it becomes very important to try to figure out why we can't seem to get a straight answer out of these people, why we have to drag the truth out of them over a period of weeks, and what, in fact, was the involvement of the Prime Minister's office going back three years.
What the government says, what the Prime Minister says, what the Minister says, of course, is that they were following due process, that they couldn't get involved in the complaint in order to allow it to be investigated properly. I am not saying that makes any sense. I'm just saying that is their justification for what Andrew just explained there, Chantal.
So we have a Liberal leader who campaigns in 2015 on being a feminist and having fired 2 MPs over allegations of sexual harassment, comes into office, finds on his desk a report from a former Supreme Court justice that says that sexual harassment is endemic in the military and that an independent body is needed to handle complaints. That is on the day that you come into office. And then here we are 6 years later, appointing a former Supreme Court justice to hopefully not tell us what we already know, and to look into the mechanics of that independent review. And in between, what you have in most generous terms is gross negligence of any word, rumor, noise that there might be issues at the top of the military. Now, this is not a prime minister who does not have a report that doesn't tell you that there's a systemic problem. And when his office is seized with notions that there may be something cloudy about his chief of defense staff, doesn't think sexual harassment because that's not in the picture. It's in the picture. He has that on his desk coming in. The problem with the Prime Minister this week is that in the House of Commons, his basic defense was, I did the same thing as Stephen Harper did. And yes, he did do that, because that is what Stephen Harper did. He appointed a retired Supreme Court justice to look into it. But he promised coming into office that he would do better. And if you are the Prime Minister and you are in the least bit serious about sexual harassment, there are 2 institutions that you have some oversight over, the RCMP and the Armed Forces, where you have reports telling you that there is a problem. So would you not be keeping a special eye on anything that is kind of coming to your office? I don't think you can divorce this issue anymore from the Prime Minister by appointing Louise Arbour as Maggie Deschamps' successor to look into the same issue.
I mean, I guess I don't understand, just as a regular person, why you couldn't just do something instead of asking for another review, why you couldn't take one of those recommendations and implement them. And then I guess my other question for all of you would be, does Minister Sajjan have any credibility on which to present these ideas, given that he has been the minister since 2015 and has not made any of these moves himself? Althea.
2 things I would say. The irony of all ironies is during the press conference, even Minister Sajjan said, announcements don't make changes, our actions do. Like, they themselves recognize that they need to live up to these values and that they haven't. There's nothing that prevented them from moving forward on the recommendations that were in Madame Deschamps' report. They could have taken some time to reflect on how they were going to build an outside body, what else they would like to do, how they were going to treat complaints, because in her report, she says victims should be able to choose whether or not they want their complaint investigated, how that was going to happen. There were different suggestions percolating in academia and in civil circles on how they could do that. So yes, nothing prevented them. The second thing on Minister Sajjan, well, he's in his job because the Prime Minister has faith in him, and frankly, he seems to be doing what the Prime Minister wants him to do. That's why he's still there. Was not given a mandate to create this outside body. Could he have been? Absolutely. Why they chose not to do that, I don't know. I mean, this week in the House of Commons, we learned that more than 700 victims came forward, alleged victims, people with complaints about sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military in those 5 years.
Yeah. Andrew,
that's a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
And those are only the people who complained.
Yes, exactly. Andrew.
Okay, 2 things. One is, we know, I think, why they are acting now and in this way. They want, as Althea said, they want to punt this past the next election. And the best way to do that is to put it in the hands of a judicial inquiry and leave it at that. And nobody can really question that. they didn't do this in response to all the revelations that had come out about General Vance or about other complainants within the military. They did so immediately after it became clear that the Prime Minister's office had been involved in this file. So now that we know that the file that Mr. Sajjan didn't want to touch because he didn't want to politicize it was in fact in the supremely political hands of the Prime Minister's office, I think it behooves us to ask why they didn't want to deal with this 3 years ago. And I don't think it's coincidental that this whole thing arrived on Minister Sajjan's desk in the spring of 2018 when the Prime Minister himself was under fire, under question, for his own sexual misconduct, alleged or otherwise, which he's never really taken the trouble to properly deny. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say they would not want to have been seen to be taking down the nation's highest military officer over a sexual misconduct offense at the very time when the Prime Minister was under the same questions himself. I think they wanted to make this go away at the time, and they buried it.
Chantal.
I'm not going to go there because Andrew is clear enough on this, but I will point out that there are high political stakes for the Liberals in this, and in their desire to punt this beyond the next election and be done with it, in the sense that one of the key advantages that the Liberals have over the Conservative is that they do a lot better, they are a lot more competitive with female voters. And this is dangerous for them. And I agree with Andrew. I don't think that it is all this information coming to light that is suddenly prompting this need for non-action, but rather the fear that it could cost them their edge with female voters.
We're bringing in protections for 3 paid sick days. The federal program runs for 4 weeks. We're there for workers through this entire pandemic. We were disappointed with the federal budget. We thought that they were going to come through, but clearly they didn't. We're stepping up.
It's Ontario's Labour Minister, Monty McNaughton, unveiling his government's plans for 3 paid sick days after many mounting calls for action. Is it too little too late? Why did they put up such a political fight in the process only to end up with this solution? I'm back with Chantal, Andrew, and Althea for another round of At Issue. Chantal, why don't you start us off on this one? I always am confounded by politicians who resist, and then end up doing it anyway. And I'm not sure what that's an indication of.
I can't answer what that's an indication of, but it's a stupid way to go about things. And having resisted for so long, you get very little credit for whatever you do.
Yes.
In the case of the Ontario government, I suspect that part of the resistance came from the fact that when Doug Ford came to office, he cancelled changes brought in by his predecessor, Liberal Kathleen Wynne, that would have granted permanent 2 days of paid leave to people who work in Ontario, amended the Labour Code accordingly, and so did not want to look like they were undoing their own work and shining a light on the fact that maybe they had been too hasty in doing that. But that's, from a distance.
Well,
go ahead, it might have been a good idea, as it is a fact of life in some provinces, my own, and as far as I can tell, because the argument in Quebec, it's a permanent feature in the Labour Code, 2 days paid sick leave. And the argument in Ontario, the Ford argument, was that this devastates small business. As far as I can tell, small business is surviving in Quebec.
Althea, you wanted to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say to that I think they didn't want to do that because it's an acknowledgement that they didn't want to give Ms. Wynne a political win, basically. And also, I think ideologically, and Chantal touched on it, they have repeatedly, the Premier said, you know, he doesn't want to put that burden on businesses. I don't why taxpayers should carry that burden, I think, is a question that should be asked. What struck me is that, you know, in announcing this to great fanfare that these 3 days that the government was going to refund employers for, basically, that this was somehow the best program in the country. I thought, well, poor Yukon, they must feel like completely ignored. They have 10 days of paid sick leave during COVID that the government will refund employers for. And when, you know, the public health guidelines say that you should be at home isolating for 14 days, 3 days may not go that far. So, why not look at the Yukon model and see if that's something that could be enacted?
Even if this was ideological, and I think we probably all would agree that it was, or is, what would be wrong with a government saying, well, we're going to do this temporarily just throughout the pandemic, which is what they've ended up doing? I mean, that doesn't mean that you are leaving your whole principles behind, Andrew. Surely you are allowed some flexibility during a pandemic.
Yeah, I've got nothing against ideology. I do have something against stupidity. There's good reason for them to oppose a permanent mandatory program, because the more costly it is you make it to hire employees, the less likely employers will want to hire them. I think there's good reason to oppose it against a permanent program. But as a short-term program that the government's going to pay for in the middle of a pandemic, when you're trying to make sure people who are sick don't have to go into work or don't feel they have to go into work, I can't see exactly why they opposed it, except that they didn't want to admit that they were wrong not to have done it in the first place. Here we are a year into the pandemic. And they also wanted to pile as much blame as they could on the feds. And the feds had brought in this federal sick pay leave program, which has turned out to be a bust. It's too complicated. It's too slow to deliver. It doesn't deliver enough aid, all these kinds of problems. So for a while there, they were backing and forthing about whether they were going to piggyback this on the federal program. I think in the end, we've got a better result, but way too late in the day.
What was so fascinating, I think, this week is that you found Doug Ford's government, I think, with a predictable position because they've had it for so long, but also you would expect them probably to take that position. But for John Horgan, an NDP premier who had previously been awfully chummy with the federal government, to have the same position, we're not going to do this, we want the federal government to do more. That, to me, was even more surprising than Doug Ford's reversal. Chantal, what did you make of that?
I'm puzzled because it is, as you know, one of the key causes that the federal NDP has been fighting for federally. And that begs the question, why then is the only NDP government in the country resisting the notion that there should be, and I think that would be Jagmeet Singh's rationale, that people should have access to a couple of days of paid sick leave. Forget the pandemic. In real time and in the real world, they should be allowed to get sick and be paid 2 days a year. It doesn't sound terribly excessive if PEI can do it and Quebec can do it. Surely Ontario and BC could do it and still survive.
Does this mean then that all provinces are going to be pushed into having this debate, do you think, Althea?
Well, some provinces may not want to have it at all, and there is not a call everywhere for this to happen. We don't know what the BC program is going to look like. I think it's going to be announced on Monday. I think the truth is a lot of premiers are, oh, look at that dog.
There's the dog. He has strong views on paid sick leave. Strong views on paid sick leave. All right, we'll push through. Yeah.
What was I saying? Yes, I think the truth is it's just really expensive. Sick leave is really, really expensive. And the government does not want to create a new structural program. And it's going to have the pressure, frankly, to be seen as withdrawing a public program that might prove to be quite popular if it's easy to access. I think that's the real fear.
Okay, Andrew, do you feel as strongly about it as your dog?
There's a demonstrable need for such a program in the short term in the middle of the pandemic. The cost-benefit analysis gets a lot different if you're talking about permanent. Remember, most large employers, unionized employers, already have paid sick days. So you're talking about hundreds and thousands of smaller employers. Somehow the government's going to have to regulate and oversee, and with all sorts of potential for games playing and abuse. So I can understand why in the long run governments would be leery of getting into this. But short term, as I say, it's much harder to explain.
Although, and I'm sure everyone's seen this stat, but of the 58% of Canadians who don't have paid sick leave, 75% of those make $25,000 a year. So surely those are the very people who should have access to it, given that they seem to not make enough money, barely to survive even. I don't know who wants to weigh in on that. Yeah, Chantal.
And not every business that is not providing sick leave is a corner store with a single owner. Yeah. There are major corporations, sure. People paid on minimum wage and no pay, 2 days a year, really very excessive, gonna break the bank.
Yeah. Okay, got to leave it there. Thank you for that conversation too. Appreciate it.